of archaeologists discovered 2 bodies in Scotland, belonging to 2 people who had died 3,000 years ago before being thrown into a bog where they were preserved and mummified and then buried 300 to 600 years later. One was the body of a man and the other the body of a woman, or so they thought. Upon closer inspection, researchers quickly realized that something about the skeletal remains of both bodies weren't quite right. The man's limbs seemed out of place and the woman's jaw was slightly too large for her skull. Fast forward 10 years to 2012 and researchers discovered that they didn't find the body of 2 people, but the body parts of at least half a dozen. The woman was made up of body parts from people who had all died around the same time, while the man was made up of parts belonging to people who had died up to hundreds of years apart. Not only that, but evidence suggested that when the parts were put together, they would have still had mummified flesh on their bones, which is unpleasant to say the least, but it's a super dark and incredibly interesting discovery.
So this is incredibly cool. Archaeologists in Crete may have recently come across the most famous labyrinth in all of history, the labyrinth that was said to hold the Minotaur from Greek mythology. The Minotaur was a fearsome creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, which lived in a labyrinth on the island of Crete, as the story goes. So this 4,000-year-old labyrinth on the island of Crete may have been the actual inspiration for that ancient story, which is amazing. The labyrinth was found on Papara Hill, and it's the first structure of its kind discovered in the area. The Greek Ministry of Culture says the Minoan civilization built it between 2000 and 1700 BCE. That has 8 circular stone walls arranged into a maze formation, and some parts of the walls are still standing up to 5.5 feet high. The structure is divided into 4 sections by internal walls, creating a series of passageways, and inside there's a small circular building also divided into quadrants. Now, aside from the labyrinth's potential connection to that mythological tale of the Minotaur, they're still not 100% sure what it was actually built for, but they did find a bunch of animal bones that may have been used for rituals and offerings. Either that or animals just wandered into the maze and then were never able to make it out. That's always a possibility as well.
Next up, we have a mass grave discovered in Slovakia just 2 years ago in 2022, containing approximately 35 skeletons, the majority of which were missing their heads. The grave dates all the way back to 5000 BC, and researchers believe that the bodies excavated from the site likely belonged to the victims of sacrifice. Due to the grave site, which is essentially just a large ditch's proximity to a defense wall, archaeologists studying the find have theorized that the decapitated individuals were killed in the hopes that their sacrificial deaths would strengthen the wall and therefore provide safety to the communities living in the area. Many of the skeletons found belong to people who died around the middle or near end of their pre-adulthood lives, I'm talking 20 and under, which indicate that they might have been sacrificed for their strength, stamina, and agility.
In 2015, archaeologists made a pretty remarkable but unsettling discovery in Flanders, Belgium. They uncovered the bodies of 125 World War I soldiers in a perfectly preserved German trench system. So this area had been untouched since the war ended, hidden beneath what is now a housing development. Most of the soldiers were German, but there were also British, French, and South African men. The soldiers fell during some of the fiercest battles of the war. Some of their remains were found right where they had died. Others were buried in mass graves by their comrades, often with religious artifacts. And the site was about the size of 2 football fields on a ridge known as Hill 80. This ridge saw intense combat, especially during the First Battle of Ypres in November of 1914, where a lot of German soldiers died. The area was later taken by British and Irish troops in June of 1917, but then the Germans retook it again in 1918, leading to even more casualties on both sides. There were more personal items as well, like watches, religious items like crucifixes and rosary beads, and there was even a bottle of HP sauce, which just goes to show that these were real people, you know, making food. And I think a lot of times when we look back on these wars, it's easy to disconnect from the fact that, you know, they had HP sauce they were cooking with. Makes it all seem more real.
Next up, we have a pretty macabre discovery made in 2019 during an excavation that took place in Selango, Ecuador. Along with the remains of 11 people who would have been buried at the site and multiple ancient artifacts were 2 helmets. made from human bones. Skulls, to be exact, and young ones too. Apparently, 2 of the young bodies they found were wearing the skulls of other slightly older young people over their heads like some kind of disturbing medieval bike helmet. I shudder to think of what they might have used for straps. While it is unknown why the helmets were placed onto the heads of the young bodies, it is assumed that it was likely done so during the time of their burials as part of a ritual designed to protect them in the afterlife. However, other theories suggest that the young bodies were buried as part of a ritual meant to calm an active volcano nearby, i.e. they were sacrifices. It's pretty dark.
So when you look at this image here, you probably assume this poor guy died instantly being crushed by this boulder, right? Well, it turns out that may not be the case. Don't get me wrong, he still died horrifically though. In fact, he went out in a much worse way. This is the body of a man who's been dubbed the unluckiest man, and he died in Pompeii during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Archaeologists recently removed the boulder to examine the remains and found that the dude's skull was surprisingly intact. The Pompeii Archaeological Park made a statement about the discovery, saying, quote, "The identified skeletal remains consist of the upper part of the thorax, the upper limbs, the skull, and jaw. His death was presumably not therefore due to the impact of the stone block, as initially assumed, but likely to asphyxia caused by the pyroclastic flow." So this dude was trapped under a boulder. Yeah, I'd say he really lives up to his name. Yippee for him.
Next up, we have the Sandby Borg killings discovered in 2010 during a study of a 5th century Swedish site in the island of Åland. While excavating the grounds, an archaeologist stumbled upon the ruins of an old home, and while exploring the home, they came across a human skeleton. At first, they wondered why it wouldn't have been given a proper burial, but then they came across another, and another, until the remains of 26 people were counted by the team, all showing signs of having died at the same time due to execution-style killings. It became apparent then that a mass killing event had taken place in the home sometime between 450 and 550 AD. Also found in the home were fossilized half-eaten fish, coins, and jewelry, supporting the theory of an ambush attack. But there was no evidence to suggest who carried out the killings or why.
Here's a pretty strange recent find: plastic rocks in nature. Scientists have been looking at Brazil's volcanic Trindade Island for years, but just in 2023 there was an unsettling discovery: rocks made from melted plastic debris. The island has always been a nesting ground for green turtles, but now it's also home to these strange plastic-infused rocks. The plastic rocks are being called plastiglomerates. Plastiglomeratus? Well, they're formed from a mixture of natural sediments and plastic. So they form on plastic waste, mainly from fishing nets apparently, melts and combines with the natural material on the beach. Geologist Fernanda Avelar Santos said the place where we found these samples is a permanently preserved area in Brazil, near the place green turtles lay their eggs. This makes the discovery even more alarming as it highlights how pervasive plastic pollution has become. She continues, "The garbage in the sea and the plastic dumped incorrectly in the oceans is becoming geological material preserved in the Earth's geological records." Interesting to see what'll happen like 100 years from now when this continues to happen.
Next up, we have a discovery made in 2003 by a group of archaeologists exploring the Atacama Desert of Chile. A mummified skeleton that, at first glance, looks a bit like it belongs to the body of someone or something that did not find its origins on this planet. I mean, it has 10 ribs instead of 12, giant eye sockets, and an incredibly elongated skull that ends in a point. For decades, UFO enthusiasts were convinced that the skeleton belonged to an alien, so much so that the mummy was actually featured in a 2013 UFO documentary. Unfortunately for the believers, in 2018 the alien theory was debunked when good old DNA testing decided to join the party. Turns out the genes were 100% human, and the body belonged to a young female living 500 years ago with severe genetic bone mutations. Or so they say.
And finally, we have Aramu Muru. This place sounds really intriguing to me. So Aramu Muru is a rock formation near Lake Titicaca in Peru, which has some very strange stories attached to it. So this massive stone structure is often referred to as the Gate of the Gods. It stands about 23 feet tall and has a perfectly carved 7-meter high rectangular niche in its center. So the question has always been, though, what is the origin of this place? What was it made for? Local folklore tells tales of the pre-Inca civilization, suggesting that Amaru Muru is a gateway to another dimension. According to the legend, Aramu Muru was an ancient priest who used a golden disc known as the Key of the Gods of the Seven Rays to open the portal and pass through it with his followers, never to be seen again. But archaeologists and researchers, of course, have their own theories. Some think that the place is a ceremonial site, possibly linked to nearby Tiwanaku culture, known for its advanced understanding of stone carving and alignment with astronomy. Until this day, though, the true origin and the purpose of this place is still relatively unknown. But what makes it even weirder is that there are a number of stories of people going missing around here. There are also reports of a strange bluish glow coming from the area. We've all heard of Neanderthals, but there were other early human species, some of which were roaming around at the same time as us as well. One of these were the Denisovans, which were only recently discovered in 2010. Out of all the types of archaeological finds, I think discovering a new subspecies of archaic human would be the most fascinating. It's just wild to think that at one time there were different species of humans living on the planet. An ancient female finger bone had been found in a cave called Denisova in Siberia in 2008. In 2010, mitochondrial DNA was extracted, which pointed to the bone coming from an undiscovered species, now known as the Denisovan. Also inside the cave were Neanderthal remains, meaning the two species may have coexisted. The Denisovans lived across Asia from 285 to 25,000 years ago and would have interbred with modern humans, as there are small traces of their DNA in us today, mostly in Malaysians and Aboriginal Australians. They also interbred with Neanderthals. In 2012, in that same cave in Siberia, the fossil specimen of a young half Denisovan, half Neanderthal female was discovered, which they named Denny. She's the only first-generation hybrid hominin that's ever been discovered.
For many years, it was believed that slaves were forced to build the pyramids against their will, under the harsh conditions of the desert sun and in fear of extreme and painful punishment. Well, according to a recent discovery, that might not have actually been the case. At the turn of the 21st century, an ancient cemetery was discovered in Giza that historians believe disprove the forced labor theory and instead support a much more peaceful illustration of the past, in which workers were able to take breaks at will and were actually praised for their service in creating the Great Pyramid. So why do they think this? Well, because the cemetery revealed that those who died while working on the Great Pyramids were given honorable burials close to the royal tombs they helped to construct. Persons found in the cemetery had also been buried with gifts, such as jars of beer and bread, to aid them in their journey to the afterlife. If they were slaves, they would have received no such luxuries. The simple discovery has changed historians' entire understanding of social class in the deserts of ancient Egypt.
These Indonesian cave paintings may be the oldest in the world. In 2014, a bunch of ancient cave paintings were discovered in a cave in Sulawesi Island. They were determined to be between 40 to 50,000 years old, making them thousands of years older than the oldest known cave art at the time. Before this discovery, it was thought that the oldest cave art had been created in Europe, but based on the findings in Indonesia, that's clearly not the case. As archaeologist Adam Brum, who discovered the painting, stated, it adds to the evidence that the first modern human cave art traditions did not arise in Ice Age Europe, as long assumed, but an earlier point in the human journey. The paintings are pretty spectacular too. It's all pretty clear considering how ancient it is. There are human-like figures, there's these three big pig-like creatures, tons of human hand stencils. I mean, how amazing would it be to step into a cave and look at handprints made by people living 50,000 years ago?
In 2021, a trail of fossilized footprints changed historians' entire understanding of the timeline of human migration. The footprints were discovered in what was once, around 23,000 years ago, a salt lake and what is now the Tularosa Basin in New Mexico. It was shocking to say the least, because the discovery meant that humans had arrived in the Americas up to 10,000 years before what was previously thought. thought, meaning that they would have interacted with ice-aged animals like mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. Saber-toothed tigers being my personal favorite extinct animal. The fossilized footprints disappear and reappear annually with the shifting sands of the basin, so they are not always available for viewing, unfortunately. But if you would like, you can see an exact replica of the groundbreaking discovery at the Tularosa Visitors Center.
In central China, archaeologists discovered stone tools that changed what they previously thought about early human migration. The tools, found at a site called Shangshen, are about 2 million years old, a lot earlier than the previously oldest known tools found in Eurasia, which were around 1.85 million years old. Between 2004 and 2017, a team of geologists dug into a slope in central China. They found 96 stone tools in different layers of sediment. The tools were left just where they had been used, making it kind of easy for them to date them accurately. The tools included sharp-edged flakes for cutting and chunks of rock that had been used to make them. Before this find, the oldest known human fossils outside of Africa were found at a site in Georgia, dating back from between 1.85 and 1.77 million years ago. The tools at Shangshen are about 250,000 years older than that, meaning that clearly humans left Africa and reached central China much earlier than we thought before.
For so long, we have viewed Neanderthals as brutish, barbaric, and kind of unintelligent, but a recent discovery in Spain has led historians to believe that there might have been much more to our hairy cousin species than previously thought. In 2010, a collection of decorative shells dating back to up to 50,000 years ago were discovered in a cave in southern Spain. The shells had been colored and pierced with holes, likely so that they could be worn as jewelry. What does this discovery tell us? Well, that ancient Neanderthals had the capacity to think symbolically and create intricate works of art, making them much smarter and more in touch with their emotions than ever imagined. Other archaeological finds such as rock art, seafaring technologies, evidence of navigation, long-distance interactions, and ceremonial burials present in the Neanderthal world have also supported this theory. In fact, some people believe that Neanderthals were actually smarter than us, but that we were more ruthless, and that's why we're here today, and they're not.
It seems like Indonesia really may have been the birthplace for visual art. In 2014, scientists found something really surprising in Indonesia, a shell with geometric patterns engraved on it. This shell, discovered on a riverbank, was dated to be at least 430,000 years old. What's amazing is that these patterns aren't even believed to have been created by modern humans at all, but Homo erectus, an ancient human species we never thought had the capacity for artistic expression. Before this find, we didn't think Homo erectus had the ability to create art or think abstractly, and this discovery may have changed that, showing that this proto-human species may have actually had complex cognitive abilities and that art actually predates modern humans. Maybe etching things into rock, or in this case shells, didn't just come about with us. Instead, it seems that even our distant relatives like Homo erectus had the capacity for creativity, which is actually kinda nuts to think about.
Perhaps one of the most important artifacts used to rewrite, or more accurately, properly understand history would be the Rosetta Stone, which is not just a language learning software, but a broken part of a larger stone slab with the same message carved in 3 different types of writing. Before the discovery of the stone, Egyptian hieroglyphics were completely undecipherable. But because of the fact that one of the messages on the stone was written in ancient Greek, and historians knew how to read ancient Greek, scholars were able to decipher the previously illegible Egyptian hieroglyphics and uncover many of the secrets of ancient Egyptian civilizations. The story on the stone told of an ancient royal cult and the first anniversary of the cult ruler's coronation. The translation of the Rosetta Stone led to the translation of all ancient Egyptian texts, including pyramid and coffin inscriptions that describe burial practices and class structures within ancient Egypt. Without it, we would be completely lost when it comes to the who's who and what's what of ancient Egyptian, well, everything.
This next discovery is super recent. News about it just came out in April. So just outside the city of Limoges, researchers from the Institute of Preventive Archaeological Research, or INRAP, found remnants of a Roman-era pool and wall surrounding a natural freshwater spring. What's exciting is that this site might be even older, dating back to the Neolithic period, around 4,500 to 6,000 years ago. The Romans built their structure on top of what was likely a sacred sacred well from ancient times. The site included Roman coins, ceramic fragments, and a ceramic depiction of what looks a bit like Medusa, placed near the water source for protection. The second discovery was about 9 miles southeast of Dijon. INRAP uncovered a site that was likely used by humans from the Neolithic period to the Iron Age. At the center of the site, a mysterious monument with 3 interconnected enclosures. A circular enclosure, a horseshoe-shaped one, and an almost square-shaped one. Nearby, they found a necropolis with 5 circular burial enclosures dating back to the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Inside there, they found artifacts like copper alloy pins, ceramic fragments, and a necklace with around 40 amber beads.
In late 2022, a discovery made in an ancient religious sanctuary near the village of San Cassiano dei Bani in Italy challenged everything historians knew about the relationship between the Etruscan civilization, which dominated ancient Italy, and the Romans. Originally, it was believed that the Etruscan civilization fell to the expanding Roman civilization in the late 14th century BC after being defeated in war, but a hoard of 24 Etruscan and Roman statues discovered side by side in the dirt might just be rewriting that story. The statues date between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, and they depict gods and replicas of human organs, and they would have been tossed into what was once the thermal waters of the small village of San Cassiano dei Bani by individuals hoping to rid themselves of their ailments. The mix of the statues shows that the civilizations actually had a close relationship, close enough to pray together and even to share sacred prayer sites. A fascinating discovery connecting 2 civilizations previously believed to have been sworn enemies with limited interactions outside the parameters of war.
So, Neanderthals are often depicted looking pretty much exactly like modern-day humans, just with bigger brow ridges and more animal pelts. But a few years back, a much freakier depiction of Neanderthals, or Neanderthals, I know there's some people who think it's Neanderthal. Anyway, a depiction of Neanderthals was presented by author Danny Vendramini, who also has an interest in evolutionary biology. He wrote a book called Them and Us: How Neanderthal Predation Created Modern Humans. The main thesis is that Neanderthals weren't these peaceful dummies that we preyed on and killed off. Instead, they were the ones hunting us. He believed Neanderthals were apex predators, the stuff of nightmares, and that they looked a little bit more like this. Yeah, big, mean-looking ape monsters. And he makes some pretty interesting points. I mean, for one, they did have thicker bones than us. They were stockier, stronger. We know from studying their teeth that they hunted and ate meat. He also looked at the shape and size of their eye sockets, theorizing that based on how large they were, it's possible they were able to see in the dark, which is freaky if it's true. Or at least, they had better vision at night than we did. And because these Neanderthals terrorized us for thousands of years, we have this fear of big hairy beasts just etched into our collective psyche. Now, there's a lot of debate here. His book is kind of controversial in the anthropology world, but it's a pretty killer idea. It would make for an awesome movie.
Next on our list, we have the fact that we got a lot wrong about the true nature of Neanderthals, which is pretty disturbing when you think about how much work and tax dollars went into a bunch of scientists coming to the wrong conclusion despite years of research and an endless stream of resources, but whatever. At one point in time, it was believed, as James just stated, that both Neanderthals and humans lived completely separately and that Neanderthals were savages, but research shows that that was just simply not the case. In fact, Neanderthals, like humans, were incredibly resilient and knowledgeable and able to adapt to a wide range of climates. They were also, as James did mention, incredibly skilled and organized hunters who thrived on a certain kind of tribal societal order. But here's the thing, in many instances, Neanderthals did actually live side by side with humans, and they bred with them too, which is why so many of us alive today actually do have traces of Neanderthal DNA, although not all instances of adult encounters were consensual, but more on that in a bit.
In 2018, the bones of a young Neanderthal were discovered, and not only were they the oldest human remains discovered in Poland, the poor thing suffered a pretty brutal death. It had been eaten by some massive prehistoric bird. Man, imagine roaming around in a time where there were birds so big they could eat you. And all you'd be armed with is a sharp rock attached to a stick. They were finger bones found in a cave in Poland. They had been digested. Unfortunately, the bones were too poorly preserved to conduct any DNA analysis, but the lead archaeologist, Paweł Waldej-Nowak, believes they belonged to a very young Neanderthal, stating they came from a very deep layer of the cave, a few meters below the present surface, a layer that also contained the typical stone tools that would have been used by Neanderthals.
Okay, so I know in my last point I literally just mentioned the fact that Neanderthals were much more sophisticated than we had previously theorized, and while that is true, it doesn't mean that they didn't do some seriously messed up things. It is believed that for over 50,000 years, while some Neanderthal tribes lived peacefully amongst humans, others did not, and those who did not were pretty brutal about it. Turns out Neanderthals who didn't want to hang out with humans still wanted something to do with them, and that something is sex. Scientists believe that in many cases Neanderthals killed and ate human men while forcing human women into intimate adult encounters. Some scientists also theorize that there was a time in which humans were almost completely wiped out by Neanderthals, but luckily humans fought back, and they fought back hard, and they were able to rebuild their civilization and ultimately prevail.
But when Neanderthals weren't attacking us for our bodies, they were looking at the ones around them. Inbreeding. It's something that we kind of frown upon today, to say the least, but throughout history, it was more common than we're comfortable enough to admit, and Neanderthals were no exception, which is gross, but not really shocking in the slightest. There are tons of theories as to how the Neanderthals finally died out. Some researchers think inbreeding could have played a big role. Inbreeding among Neanderthals was common. They often mated with close relatives like cousins, even siblings. This was discovered through analysis of bones and DNA. For example, a Neanderthal toe bone found in Siberia showed that its parents were closely related. So this would have caused problems for them, just like it does in humans today. They had body parts and bones that didn't develop properly, like misshapen kneecaps and vertebrae. Some even kept baby teeth into adulthood. Because of these issues, inbred Neanderthals were, of course, weaker and had a harder time having offspring of their own compared to early humans.
Next up, we have got the fact that it is incredibly possible that Neanderthals did in fact partake in ritual sacrifice, but not the sacrifice of humans, as far as we know. In 1921, bear remains were found inside of a cave in Drachenloch, Switzerland, suggesting the possibility of ritual sacrifices performed by Neanderthals and giving way to the myth of the cult of cave bear. After the discovery, some archaeologists came to the conclusion that the findings meant one thing and one thing only, that the bears killed in the Swiss cave had been part of a coming-of-age / rite of passage ritual performed by young male Neanderthals wanting to prove themselves to their tribe. While that theory is yet to be proved, and very well likely never will be, it's an interesting one nonetheless.
So if you need any more proof as to why Neanderthals were scarier than we often think, let's take a look, talk a bit more about some of these animals they hunted, like the cave bear and the cave lion. I don't think it gets any more ferocious than prehistoric lions and bears. Cave bears were about the same size as modern day brown bears, sometimes larger though, likely weighing in at over 1,500 pounds. Bones of cave lions have been found all over Europe, with the biggest specimens being over 8 feet in length, and that's not even counting the tail. Terrifying. And what's cool is that along with these bones, cave paintings have been found, which gives us a pretty good idea of what these animals would have looked like. Cave lions, for example, didn't look like they had manes of any kind. So yeah, thanks to all our proto-human ancestors for documenting that for us.
Next up, we have another theory that hits pretty close to home, depending on your beliefs, I suppose, and that is that the Neanderthals were wiped out due to climate change and a rising in the human population, and disease, and a decline in biodiversity. Sound familiar? When humans began spreading out over the globe, they became a serious threat to not only Neanderthals, but also the large animals that made up the majority of the Neanderthals' diet, as well as the forest, jungle, and grassland areas that those large animals relied on to survive. You see, humans are not great at sustainability, and so they were killing these large animals at a rate in which they could not recover from. After that, they began wiping out lush areas of trees and grass that the planet so desperately needed to maintain itself. The climate began to change, making it incredibly difficult for Neanderthals to survive. Not only that, but as humans continued to spread across continents, they also spread their diseases. Diseases that, as James said, the inbred Neanderthal immune systems were just not strong enough to fight off. The combination of a declining ecosystem leading to unmanageable climate change as well as deadly disease is ultimately what led to the extinction of the species. So I guess you have us to thank?
But Neanderthals didn't die out entirely. There are traces of their DNA in us. Unless you're just straight up African, it's likely you have some Neanderthal DNA in you, especially if you're of East Asian or European descent. As Hannah discussed earlier, Neanderthals and modern day humans did interbreed, willingly or not, and some of that DNA still lingers in us to this day. These Neanderthal genes in our DNA can affect things like our immune systems, our skin, our hair, and there are some negative traits believed to have been passed down as well. Traits and adaptations that would have helped Neanderthals 40,000 years ago as they were migrating to new non-African environments, but aren't super helpful now, like sun sensitivity. Apparently people with higher amounts of Neanderthal DNA have higher risks of sun sensitivity. I don't know if this is just a myth or not, but I always heard that if you're someone who looks at the sun and then you sneeze, you might have higher Neanderthal amounts of their DNA in you. I'd always sneeze when I look at the sun. And apparently higher Neanderthal DNA could also be linked with higher rates of depression. So that's all very interesting. How wild does this look? This is the skeleton of a prehistoric man that's grown into the cave where he died. Gnarly. He was later dubbed the Altamura Man, but who was he? Well, the Altamura Man is actually the most complete Neanderthal fossil ever discovered. In 1993, cave explorers came across the bones in the Lama Lunga cave near Altamura, Italy. They found an upside-down human skull embedded in rock, along with many other bones. The skull was covered in shiny mineral deposits known as coralloid. This gave them some indication of how old the remains were. Scientists believe the Altamura Man fell into a sinkhole and got trapped. Obviously, he never managed to escape. Over time, calcium deposits in cave formations sealed his body, turning it into a kind of natural tomb. Researchers eventually concluded that the remains were about 130,000 to 172,000 years old, making this one of the oldest Neanderthal fossils ever found. Two Dutch artists, Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, reconstructed what the Altamura Man likely looked like, which was probably something like this. Jamestown, established in 1607, was England's first permanent settlement in North America. From the start, things weren't easy. The colonists battled harsh conditions, disease, and food shortages. One of the darkest periods was the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time. During this season, many settlers couldn't find enough food, and about 75% of them died. To survive, those who lived resorted to eating whatever they could, including each other. Now, there have been all kinds of creepy and bizarre things discovered at this site over the years, but one of the most grim was in 2012 when archaeologists came across the bones of a young girl. The bones were covered in marks that had clearly been left by blades, as if she'd been cut up and eaten like a steak. And a series of other human remains were found in a kitchen cellar mixed in with various animal bones, most dated back to the Starving Time, so it was highly likely these poor folks had been eaten. Well, these folks look comfy, don't they? These are called fire mummies, human remains stored in a very specific way, a way that actually does make a lot of sense for saving space, but sounds pretty gruesome when described. The fire mummies of the Philippines, or the Kabayan mummies, are found in the mountain slopes of Kabayan in the northern Philippines, dating back as far as 2000 BCE. The mummies were created by the Ibaloy people, who would store them in caves. As for the mummification process, it would actually start while the person was still alive. Now, this wasn't a punishment kind of thing or anything like that. It would be done when someone was right on the verge of death. They'd drink a very salty beverage to prepare their body. After death, the body would be washed and positioned upright over a fire to dry out all the fluids. To further preserve the body, smoke from tobacco would be blown into the mouth to dry out the internal organs, and various herbs would be rubbed into to the skin. Finally, the mummy would be crammed into a small pinewood coffin and laid to rest. It may seem kind of creepy to many of us today, imagining being crunched up in this position in death, but again, it is great for storage. You don't usually think of gladiator bones being found anywhere outside of Rome, but in 2010 an entire gladiator grave was unearthed in Britain. Excavations led by the York Archaeological Trust in 2010 uncovered 80 skeletons dating back to the 1st to 4th century CE. Most of these remains were male, robust, and taller than average. Most disturbingly, a lot of the men had their heads separated from their bodies, either having them placed in their hands or between their knees. Pretty gruesome. But it appeared as if they'd been buried with respect. Forensic analysis revealed bite marks on one skeleton, which had probably been made by a lion, tiger, or bear, another clue they'd been gladiators fighting in an arena with wild animals. A lot of the skeletons also had one arm significantly stronger than the other, a sign of intense weapons training from a very young age. The findings came from the Driffield Terrace site, where excavation had began in 2004. Dr. Michael Wysocki from the University of Central Lancashire stated, "These are internationally important discoveries. We don't have any other potential gladiator cemeteries with this level of preservation anywhere else in the world." Look at this poor fella. In 2014, archaeologists in Bulgaria found these remains at a 13th century Thracian site, the remains of a man who had been staked as a vampire. The skeleton belonged to a man who was likely in his 40s at the time, and an iron rod had been driven through his chest to prevent him from rising from the dead. His left leg had also been removed and placed beside his body, just to make sure he wouldn't be able to walk around if he did manage to de-stake himself. During the period these bones were dated, many Eastern European cultures believed that vampires were a very real danger, particularly when it was someone who died under what was deemed an unusual circumstance. So to protect the living, communities would stake bodies to make sure they wouldn't come back. This isn't the only corpse found to have been a so-called vampire burial. Far from it. Remains have been found across Bulgaria and other parts of Europe. At a site in Poland, archaeologists found remains of people buried with a sickle placed over their throat so that if they rose from the dead, they'd lob off their own heads as they sat up. And there's something very cartoony, very Looney Tunesy about that method, in a definitely more grim, macabre sort of way. In 2012, in the small village of Bergheim, France, archaeologists found an ancient pit filled with human bones, specifically arms, hands, and fingers. This pit, known as Pit 157, is about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep, and it dates back nearly 6,000 years. The excavation began when an archaeological company was conducting surveys ahead of construction work in the area. While exploring a 5-acre site filled with ancient storage pits called silos, they discovered a total of 60 silos, 14 of which contained human bones. Pit 157 stood out because it was nearly filled with human remains, unlike the others, which were mostly empty or had different types of artifacts. The bones found in the pit included at least 7 upper limbs from different people. Shortly after these limbs were discarded, the bodies of 7 other individuals were also thrown into the pit. As for exactly what happened here, that's a mystery. Who killed these people? Why were their arms removed? Unfortunately, the answers to those questions have been lost to time. Not only was the Krakatoa volcano eruption of 1883 incredibly deadly, it also produced the loudest sound ever heard by human ears. People 3,000 miles away described it sounding like cannon fire. Here's a piece of audio recording of what it likely would have sounded like, not that we can mimic the actual intensity. The eruption began on May 20th and continued until October 21st. The most catastrophic moment, though, came on August 27th, when over 70% of the island and surrounding areas were obliterated. The eruption claimed at least 36,417 lives, mostly due to the tsunamis that it triggered. The explosive force was so great that it caused waves up to 120 feet high, devastating coastal towns and changing some landscapes permanently. The consequences extended far beyond Indonesia. The ash cloud affected weather patterns worldwide. The creepiest part, though, are the stories that surfaced in the months and years following this eruption. Large fields of pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock, floated across the Indian Ocean, and many of these pumice rafts carried human skeletons. One story goes that in July of 1884, students at a mission school in Zanzibar playing at the beach discovered black volcanic stones washing ashore. As they went to get a closer look, they were horrified to find human bones mixed in among the stones. Turned out skeletons had been washing up along the southeastern coast of Africa for almost a year after the eruption. In 2016, archaeologists excavating an ancient Greek cemetery discovered the remains of at least 80 skeletons found in a mass grave. These skeletons date back to between the 8th and 5th century BCE and were shackled by iron cuffs around their wrists. It looked like they'd been victims of a mass execution. The site is part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis, an ancient burial ground that was uncovered during construction for a new National Opera House and library in downtown Athens. The head of the excavation stated at the time that they were, quote, executed, all in the same manner, but that they were buried with respect. So the question is, who were these folks? Why were they taken out, and why were they buried with such care? Most of the skeletons belonged to very young people who appeared to be in good health at the time of their deaths as well. Is this a death metal album cover, or is this an actual archaeological find? Well, you clicked the video, you know the answer. Yes, this is a real wall of human skulls constructed by the ancient Aztecs. Archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History came across a tower filled with 119 human skulls while restoring a building on the site of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. This tower is believed to be one of the 7 that once stood in this ancient city, located near the ruins of the Templo Mayor, a religious center dedicated to the Aztec gods of war and rain. Researchers first thought the skulls belonged mainly to defeated male warriors, but more recent analysis revealed that some of these skulls belonged to women and youths as well. Archaeologist Barrera Rodriguez said that while some of the skulls may have belonged to warriors, others could have been from people used in sacrificial ceremonies. In Aztec culture, human sacrifices were viewed as necessary acts to sustain the gods and, by extension, protect the universe itself. Rukpind Lake in the Himalayas of India has a pretty ominous nickname. It's often referred to as Skeleton Lake, and that's because, for a brief period during the summer, the frozen surface of the lake melts, revealing hundreds of human skeletons lying at the bottom. The skeletons were first reported in the 19th century, but gained more attention when a game reserve ranger came across the remains again in 1942. At the time, the belief was that the skeletons belonged to Japanese soldiers, but it turned out the remains were much older. In 2004, it was discovered that these bones dated back to around 850 CE and belonged to 2 distinct groups of people. Most likely they were killed by a severe hailstorm, as analysis showed that a lot of them had suffered blunt force trauma to their upper bodies. So back in 1995, on a casual day of mummy hunting, as one does, anthropologist Johann Reinhardt and his gang stumbled upon something pretty mind-blowing on Mount Ampato in the Andes Mountains of Peru. Enter Mummy Juanita, also known as the Ice Maiden or Lady of Ampato. Juanita was a teenage Inca girl making her way to about 14 years old before meeting her unfortunate end. The crazy part was that this discovery was accidental. Reinhardt and his crew were on a mission to find another Inca mummy when, whoopsie daisy, they stumbled upon Juanita in a crevice at a whopping 20,600 feet above sea level. Quite the surprise. She was wrapped up in layers of vibrant textiles, lying there with all kinds of goodies around her, ceramics, metals, food, even tiny statues. All of these extra items she was adorned with made it pretty likely that she had been sacrificed, likely to the gods. Next on the list is the Screaming Mummy. Yeah, if you thought your regular old mummy was unsettling, how about one who died in pain and terror with a face eternally stuck in a scream? That is the Screaming Mummy, also known as Man-E. This mummy was discovered in 1886 by Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiques Service. Man-E didn't seem to go through your typical mummification ritual. For one, his internal organs hadn't been removed, and his hands and feet were bound. So that combined with his terrified expression meant it was pretty likely this guy had been buried alive, which is absolutely horrifying. That's one of my worst fears. At the very least though, he'd been in pain when he died. So is this mummy cursed? Let's just say I'd be far more surprised to discover that it wasn't. Next we have a story about a disturbing music box. This story was shared to Reddit by Majestic Park, who talked about a music box her ex-boyfriend had that was passed down to him from his grandmother after she passed away. Majestic Park talked about how off the thing made them feel. They couldn't even play the thing and tried to stay away from it as much as possible. It just had a bad vibe about it. They went on to write, "The boyfriend moved out of the house, and when he left, I put all the things he left behind out in the storeroom, including the music box. I had hell after that. I had health problems. Both of my dogs got cancer and had to be put down. My car constantly broke down. My mother took ill and died. A mentally ill neighbor started stalking and harassing me, and I was constantly at odds with my friends and coworkers. Plus, I started having money problems. Finally, I decided to move and get rid of all the old boyfriend's things. I threw that effing music box in the back of my pickup with all the other stuff and hauled it to the dump. I have no idea if it had anything to do with getting rid of the music box. My life started to even out and got better. I was able to get a new car. I got another boyfriend, I bought a house, and my troubles with my friends and coworkers started to subside. The crazy neighbor was sent to a treatment hospital, and a friend gave me a wonderful dog. I had a good run of about 10 years before anything else bad happened to me." Next on the list is the cursed spear point. So another Redditor talked about an artifact that may have been responsible for some bad stuff as soon as they found it. User Grok23 wrote, "I found a spear point in a really old medicine wheel here in Wyoming. I took it and instantly got bad vibes. A lot of creepy happened until I returned it. Don't mess with native sacred sites." And that's where the post ends. So then someone else asked them what creepy stuff happened. So Grok23 continued with, "On the way home, my motorcycle's tire blew up and threw me off, and I almost stabbed myself on the spearhead. Obsidian, so pretty sharp. That night, I kept hearing banging noises on my wall and had sleep paralysis where I saw some shadow figures. The next day, I apologized and placed it back in the medicine wheel, which looked like this." And he attached this image here. Yeah, that is actually a lot of stuff to happen in a very short span of time. I'd be getting rid of that thing too. We're back to mummies again, this time with what has been dubbed the Scottish Frankenstein mummies. So in 2001, archaeologists were doing a dig in a Bronze Age settlement in Scotland where they dug up a pair of 3,000-year-old skeletons. One was male, the other was female. They'd fully decomposed at this point and were just skeletons, but the team performed tests on the bones and discovered that they had been intentionally preserved initially. This was pretty cool on its own because intentional mummification in Europe was rare. But the creepy part comes next. Turned out that each of these skeletons were cobbled together like Frankenstein-style creations. The male skeleton had parts belonging to 3 different men. A torso from one, a skull and neck from another, and a lower jaw from some other guy. And the female actually had a male skull, a female torso, and the arm of somebody else. Until this day, researchers don't know why these bones were pieced together like that. Next we have the knife-handed skeleton. Alright, I'm not actually sure if this next thing is cursed, but it's so damn cool, I couldn't help but throw it on the list. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it brought some bad luck. What did folks in the medieval times do when they had a limb lobbed off in battle? Well, most of them just died. Some of you may be shocked by this, but folks back then didn't have quite the same quality of medical care that we do now. Apparently people wouldn't always die though after having their hand detached from their arm with the help of a battle axe. In the early 90s, Italian archaeologists dug up a male skeleton with a missing right forearm, and to compensate, he attached a knife to his forearm with some sort of medieval style prosthesis, likely made of buckles and straps. You see, the teeth on the right side of his mouth were super worn down, meaning he was most likely tightening the prosthesis with his teeth, you know, kind of like going like that. Now, of course, people are sometimes born missing limbs, but that was not the case here. Researchers made a 3D model of his right arm with a CT scan and discovered that there had been severe blunt force trauma to his forearm. So this guy had his forearm removed, survived the procedure in a time where medical care was a total joke, and then attached a blade to his arm to keep fighting another day. Someone needs to make a movie about this guy. Next on the list, we have the cursed stela. This is an ancient artifact that comes in two parts. So back in 1879, one half was in Syria, but today it sits in the British Museum. The other half went on a different adventure, landing at the Bonhams auction house in London. Now, the British Museum had a shot at reuniting these two long-lost halves in 2014, but they decided against it. And why was that? Well, there were two reasons. For one, it was a bit of a mystery as to how the lower half, up for grabs at the auction, left Syria. All we know is that it supposedly passed from father to son in the 60s. Cue the suspicious side-eye and conspiracy theories about it being swiped from its home country. And secondly, there's the curse. The inscription on the artifact, when translated to English, is a warning that reads, "Whoever discards this image from the presence of Salmanu puts it into another place, whether he throws it into water or covers it with earth or brings and places it into a taboo house where it is inaccessible. May the god Salmanu, the great lord, overthrow his sovereignty. May his name and his seed disappear into the land. May he live in a contingent together with the slave woman of his land." So housing it in a British museum certainly counts as putting it into another place. So they opted not to purchase the second half, perhaps partly in fear of angering Salmanu even further. The Terracotta Army. In 1974, a group of farmers in China stumbled on something big while digging a well. They found this massive pit filled with thousands of life-size clay soldiers, horses, and chariots. These clay soldiers were made over 2,000 years ago to guard the tomb of China's first emperor. The emperor wanted an army to follow him into the afterlife, so his followers made this incredible army out of clay, and each soldier was unique, with different faces, hairstyles, and even uniforms. It's incredibly impressive to look at, even just in pictures. But back to the curse part, some people claim that disturbing the emperor's tomb, which probably includes finding and digging up the Terracotta Army, brings bad luck. And the farmers who discovered it in 74 had a pretty tough time afterward. First off, their village got moved because of all the fuss about the discovery, and then a bunch of the farmers faced hardships like illness and financial troubles. Now we move on to a cursed mirror known as the Dark Mirror. It's said that this scrying mirror, which is now housed in the Traveling Museum of Paranormal and Occult, shows disturbing visions when you gaze into it. The most common thing people see is their own corpse staring right back at them. People have also reported seeing themselves rapidly aged. Some have seen their reflection move on its own, like winking or smiling at them. Or sometimes people's reflection will just vanish altogether. A man donated the mirror to the museum after buying it at a Columbus area psychic fair. As soon as he took the thing home, he started experiencing some disturbing stuff, i.e., every time he looked at the mirror, things just looked off, almost like the mirror was conjuring up his deepest, darkest fears and taunting him with them. Suffice to say, he didn't want the thing in his house anymore. Finally, though, we have the Hope Diamond. So this blue gem is currently housed at the National Museum of Natural History in DC, but its journey has been pretty dramatic, to say the least. Legend has it that this diamond was taken from an Indian idol. After that, anyone who had their hands on the thing was in for a wild ride of misfortune and tragedy. Like King Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, two big names in history who each had their fair share of drama and both possessed the Hope Diamond at one point in their lives. In 1839, a guy named Henry Thomas Hope dropped a large sum of money on the diamond, slapped his name on it, and then died. Then his family sold the gem to settle some gambling debts. After that comes jeweler Wilhelm Falls. He snags the diamond, and then his very own son takes him out. In the early 1900s, Evelyn Walsh McLean took the stage. Her kids kicked the bucket prematurely, then her husband left her, and he ended up taking his life not long afterward. And we're starting things off with the discovery of possibly the oldest art in the world. Now, the common belief is that Homo sapiens were the first human species to create art. But a finding in 2014 showed that that may not have been the case at all. Archaeologists may have found ancient art created by not our species, but by our distant ancestor, Homo erectus. Previously, we thought that the earliest evidence of sophisticated art dated back around 70 to 100,000 years ago, crafted by Homo sapiens. But in 2014, a shell engraved with geometric patterns was discovered in a riverbank in Indonesia. It was dated to be at least 430,000 years old and believed to have been made by Homo erectus. So Homo erectus was never thought to have been artistic in any way. Now, am I saying the art on this shell was like a breathtaking piece? No, I mean it zigzags etched into a shell, but it's pretty cool that this may have been created by an extinct species of human. This pushes back the timeline for complex cognitive abilities much further than we thought before, and it changes the idea that modern human behavior, in this case artistic expression and abstract thought, just suddenly came about in a burst of evolutionary innovation around 100 to 200,000 years ago. Instead, it looks like some of what we consider modern may have been around in our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years earlier. And speaking of extinct human species, there are also recent findings that point to Homo naledi possibly being more intelligent than we thought and doing stuff like burying their dead. Originally discovered in a South African cave system, these 300,000-year-old hominins were thought to have had a mix of human and pre-human features, but not much else. But recent evidence points to them having possibly been way more complex than we thought before. There's evidence that Homo naledi may have intentionally buried their dead. The idea has always been that only modern humans did that. Even more interesting are the engravings found on cave walls. Now, the age of the marks hasn't been determined to a T. If they were created by Homo naledi, it would mean they would have a level of artistic expression and brain power that, once again, we thought was unique to Homo sapiens. Now, to be fair, Homo naledi had very small brains, so that's just not just us being arrogant. It makes sense that we always thought they were just kind of dumb apes. Next up, we have new revelations about the hunting practices of foraging societies. So here's what we've always been taught in school, right? The men in ancient tribes would always be the ones out hunting while the women stayed home. And it turns out that may not be the case. Now, while it is true that men would have been hunting the majority of the time, there's recent evidence that points to women having hunted in about 80% of foraging societies around the world. And in a third of those societies, women were even taking down big game. So this particular finding started with a comprehensive review led by Carl Welsh Scheffler at the University of Washington, who delved deep into over 1,400 human societies worldwide, spanning over 150 years of studies. Now, as for why we haven't really heard much about this before, it seems there's just been a bit of a bias. The idea that men are the hunters and women stick to gathering has been so ingrained in our minds that it's just always how evidence has been interpreted. But now with this wealth of data, it's becoming more clear that women have been active participants in the hunt all along. What's also really fascinating is how flexible women's hunting strategies were. They weren't confined to one tool or method. They were using bows and arrows, knives, nets, spears, and in some cases, they were even hunting with their young strapped to their backs. Next up, we have a discovery made in 2023 of a very old Viking burial, really changing our understanding of Scandinavian history. So this mound, known as Archaeology, was believed to be a typical Viking Age burial site, but turns out there's more to it than that. Surveys of the mound uncovered large rivets, which confirmed that this was the site of a ship burial. Now, that's not surprising on its own, cool, but not surprising. This is Scandinavia, after all. What is surprising, though, is the date. It was dated to around 700 AD, which predates the Viking Age by several decades. This makes Harlashagen the oldest known ship burial in Scandinavia, and it means that the tradition of burying people in large ships began much earlier than historians once thought. It also shows that the maritime skills and technology of the region were more advanced than we thought before as well, even before the Viking Age. Next on the list, we have the Diary of Merer. It used to be a pretty common belief that the Great Pyramids were built by slaves, being yelled at and whipped as they uncomfortably hauled massive mounds of limestone, but this version of events may not be accurate, and it all changed with the discovery of the Diary of Merer, an ancient papyrus with details about how the ancient Egyptians built these structures and the lives of the workers who built them. Merer was an official who oversaw a team responsible for transporting limestone blocks from quarries to the construction site of the Great Pyramid of Giza. His diary, dated to around 4,500 years ago, had all these meticulous details of the daily operations involved in this construction. What's surprising is that Merer's diary mentions the workers being well fed and cared for, contradicting that image we have of brutal slavery often thought to be the case. Instead of slaves, it looks like the builders were skilled laborers and may have actually been compensated for their work. So there you go. Now you can rest easy at night knowing one of the 7 wonders of the world was built in an ethical way. Unless he was just lying in all those writings to make it all look better for like people discovering it in the future, you know? News of this next archaeological breakthrough was just released in 2023, and for those of you not keeping track of time, that's last year. So, human fossils were found in the Tampa Ling cave in Laos that may change researchers' understanding of human migration into Australia. These fossils were found buried deep in the cave's sediment layers, giving us very important evidence that links the journey of early humans from Africa through Southeast Asia and eventually into Australia. The common belief has always been that human migration happened mostly through sea routes, but these human remains were found in a cave 186 miles inland in 2009, so that had scientists second-guessing things. Using luminescence dating techniques, researchers were able to figure out a timeline, revealing the oldest fossils could have been between 68 and 86,000 years old, which pushes back the estimated arrival of humans in Southeast Asia by quite a bit. The findings could also mean that modern humans likely traveled through forested areas, possibly following river valleys on their journey from Africa to Asia and eventually to Australia. Were all the high-ranking members of society in ancient Europe always men? History has always taught us that was the case, but it turns out that Bronze Age Spain may have had women in powerful positions. Back in 2021, a pretty cool discovery was made in Spain. The discovery was of a woman's remains, and it looked like she'd been a ruling elite. Located beneath a Bronze Age ruin at a site in Murcia, Spain, the woman had been buried along with valuable objects like a rare silver crown. There were also the remains of a man buried along with her, and he didn't have anything cool on him. He was just a bunch of bones. This ruin was also found to have possibly been the earliest palace discovered in Western Europe from the Bronze Age. The crown wasn't the only evidence that this woman had been in a position of power. It was also the location of her burial. She'd been beneath a room with a large building complex that looked to have been both residential and political. Basically, the place could have been a palace. Next on the list, we have the bronze statues. So in 2022, statues dating back 2,300 years were discovered, and they were unlike anything seen before in Italy or even the Mediterranean. Led by archaeologist Jacob Taboli, the excavation team found 24 beautifully preserved bronze statues, including figures of gods like Hygeia and Apollo. They were also adorned with inscriptions honoring important Etruscan families. It looked as if the statues might have been submerged in the thermal waters as part of some religious ceremony, which helped keep them in such fantastic condition over the centuries that people of that time had been praying together and honoring their gods in these ancient baths. Now, what was fascinating about this discovery is that it looks like the Etruscans and Romans may have been closer than what we once thought. Next on the list, we have the possible discovery, heavy emphasis on possible, the possible discovery of Amelia Earhart's plane. So you probably heard about this in the news about a month back. People are pretty excited about this one, and if it does turn out that Amelia Earhart's plane has been found, this will put an end to a decades-old mystery. A man named Tony Romeo, the CEO of Deep Sea Vision, led a team to the Pacific Ocean close to Howland Island, where they captured sonar images using an underwater drone. They scanned 5,200 square miles of the ocean floor, and they captured what looks to be an aircraft looking similar to Amelia Earhart's Lockheed 10E Electra. Now, some say the wings, or what look like wings in the sonar image, look different than Earhart's plane. They're kind of like backward. And sure, there's totally a chance this is a different aircraft, but the wings could have also been damaged, and that's why they look to be bent back like that. At this point, we really don't know, but there's going to be an expedition later this year to see if this really is her plane. So we just gotta hold out for a little while. And we're finishing off today's list with a pretty incredible discovery made in Brazil. It all started in 2019 when a team of archaeologists were called in to inspect what seemed like a routine construction project at an apartment complex. But as they dug deeper, they stumbled on human bones along with this trove of ancient relics. And it all dated back thousands of years, some as far as 9,000. And there were over 100,000 artifacts in total, along with 43 human skeletons. And what was also really interesting is that these findings spanned layers of history. Each layer was a different civilization that once lived in the region. About 6.5 feet below the surface, archaeologists discovered remnants of a group that existed around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And this was incredibly interesting because it pushed back the timeline of humans settling in Brazil by quite a bit. The team's been working for 4 years at the site, and this finding could rewrite history, changing what anthropologists used to believe about when humans migrated into the Americas from Asia.
Starting us off in our number 10 spot, the Sumerian civilization. The ancient Sumerians were a group of people that suddenly became established in Mesopotamia circa 2900 BCE. No one is quite sure where they came from originally, but they believed and documented that their origins were not from planet Earth. According to ancient texts, the Sumerians were created by an alien race called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth after their planet Nibiru collided with another planet in the solar system. The aliens found themselves in short supply of gold, which they needed in their atmosphere, and saw that Earth was in high supply. So they landed here and created a new species that was half alien, half human to mine the gold for them. Now, it does sound a little crazy, but the Sumerians were real and they did have advanced scientific, agricultural, and technological knowledge, as well as an acute understanding of the solar system, which was highly advanced at their time. Researchers have recorded clay pot batteries that still contained electrodes, a flyable model airplane, as well as an unexplainable capability to cut large stones with exact precision. Not to mention that rockets, airplanes, and helicopters were all depicted on certain artifacts from the time too. Even stranger is that there is mitochondrial DNA evidence linked to a woman in Africa dating more than 100,000 years back near a gold mine. While of course we might never know for sure, the legend of the Anunnaki has made archaeologists question many things, and if it turns out to be true, it would certainly rewrite history.
The Baghdad Battery. The Baghdad Battery is a fascinating ancient artifact that was discovered in Iraq in 1936, consisting of a clay jar with a copper cylinder and an iron rod inside. While mainstream archaeologists consider it to be a simple vessel for storing scrolls or valuables, they're not 100% sure. So some folks have entertained a more exciting possibility. Enter the aliens. I think everything I picked has some sort of supposed alien connection, at least according to me, so prepare for that. Some hypothesize that this ancient relic is a sophisticated power device. According to some, ancient civilizations could have been far more advanced than we give them credit for, and they might have harnessed electricity for various purposes, but forget about human ingenuity. Maybe the Baghdad Battery was brought to the fine people of Earth with the assistance of a far more advanced species from outer space. Some believe that the ancient astronauts from other worlds visited Earth in the distant past and shared their knowledge of electricity with us. Maybe they left the Baghdad Battery as a small gift or a souvenir from their intergalactic journey, offering a glimpse into their advanced technology.
Number 8, a goddess. On the western coast of India, there are ruins of a temple to the goddess Patini. Now, that part alone is not unheard of, as temples and goddesses are a large part of Hinduism. However, what is out of the norm is they have found an underground secret chamber that's rumored to hold an underground shrine to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Now, the ruins are now owned by a Hindu temple and hence forbidden, so nobody's been able to check what's underneath them. But according to writer Mog Morgan, the idea that it is a secret shrine to the Egyptian goddess is very believable. He theorizes that an Egyptian traveler came to India and started a group dedicated to his own goddess, Isis, and that Patini could be the Indian evolution of the same deity. If only we could get into that chamber to know once and for all.
Next up, we have the Nazca Lines. The Nazca Lines are a series of ancient geoglyphs located in the Nazca Desert of southern Peru. They depict various shapes, including animals, plants, and geometric patterns, and the exact purpose and meaning of these etchings remains a bit of a mystery. Some theories suggest they might have been used for astronomical or religious purposes, but the strange thing is the scale of the designs means they can really only be appreciated from the air, and people weren't really looking down at the Earth 2,000 years ago. So who were these for? Were they used to appease gods, or maybe beings from outer space? There are all kinds of different images depicted, birds, monkeys, various different plants. Probably the strangest one though is what is often referred to by archaeologists as the astronaut. It's obviously a humanoid figure, but the size of the eyes and the shape of its body really does resemble some sort of spacesuit or classic extraterrestrial type being, so really leaves you with more questions than answers.
Coming in at number 6, Pudnamabaswamy Temple. In Kerala, India lies a grand temple containing 6 sealed underground vaults. Now, since its discovery, 5 of the vaults have actually been opened, and inside they found treasures, jewels, and gold worth millions. But there still remains one vault they have not been able to crack. In 2014, Supreme Court appointed committee members based on alleged mismanagement in the affairs of the temple were appointed to open the forbidden vault. First, they opened the metal grill door and discovered a sturdy wooden door just behind it. They opened this door as well and encountered a third door made of iron, which was jammed shut. The observers tried to force their way in, but failed. So they decided to hire a professional locksmith to open the door, but in mid-July, before the locksmith came, the royal family got an injunction from the Supreme Court against opening Vault B, and by July 2020, the Supreme Court refused to give permission to open the vault, as it was an issue involving religious sentiments. But it has left many wondering what is behind that last vault. Legend suggests that a spell is what is required to get open the last door, hence why the attempted prying methods used on the other 5 have been unsuccessful. But archaeologists are keen to hopefully one day be able to see what lies behind the sealed and forbidden vault.
Big circles. The big circles are mysterious archaeological features found in various locations across the Middle East. So these structures are massive circular shapes, visible only from above, and are made of stone walls or small stone mounds spread across different locations in the region, like Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. And they vary in size, with some stretching over 400 meters in diameter. But what were they built for? Nobody really knows. One of the most puzzling aspects of the big circles is their age, which is challenging to figure out without any artifacts connected with them or written records. Archaeologists have found it tough to date these structures accurately, leading to debates about their origins and the cultures that might have created them. Lots of theories have emerged in an attempt to unravel the purpose of these massive circles. Some researchers have put forward that the circles served as burial sites. Others speculate they may have been used to house animals, but the walls aren't really high enough for that. Most of them are only built like a few feet high. Of course, we have a bit of a similarity here to crop circles, and we all know the conspiracies surrounding them. So yeah, maybe, again, aliens, they could have a hand to play here too.
Next up at number 4, ape bones. At the Hill of Tara in Ireland, a set of strange bones were found, but they don't look like bones of a normal person. They belonged to an ape. And to make matters crazier, it's not even the only set of ape bones that have been found in Ireland. But the thing is, nobody knows how these apes managed to get there in the first place. And the only explanation is that someone, a long time ago, was taking apes up to Ireland and burying them there. One theory suggests that the apes might have been traded, but another theory is based on an Irish legend. The ancient legend claims that a group of strangers with magical powers came to Ireland on a massive ship and ruled the people from the Hill of Tara. Some think that the legend was based on a real event, and that the people they thought were magic were really a group of Egyptians with advanced technology. Now, this might seem a little out there, but despite that there are no native monkeys in Egypt itself, ancient Egyptians were incredibly familiar with monkeys, and they have held a permanent place in ancient Egyptian religion as one of the more important animal forms into which the gods might be transformed. On top of that, there's been actual DNA testing done on ancient Irish bodies that suggests they could have an ancestor from the Middle East. And near the Hill of Tara, there are 3,800-year-old remains of a boy wearing what appears to be an Egyptian necklace.
Next up we have hobbits. In 2003, scientists found some bones in Indonesia on the island of Flores. These bones belong to small human-like species they named Homo floresiensis, or hobbits. The hobbits were tiny, around 3 feet tall, and were determined to have lived an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 years back. This discovery really changed how we think about our own ancestors. Before, it was believed that only our species, Homo sapiens, had big brains and were smarter than other ancient humans, but the hobbits' small brain challenged that idea. It made us realize that early human relatives were more diverse and interesting than we thought. Some researchers think that the hobbits might have come from an earlier human group and experienced kind of an island dwarfism, adapting to the new environment over time. Small islands can have a weird effect on the animals that live on them, but it's still not 100% known. Finds taught us that the story of human evolution is even more complicated than we thought before. Who knows what other species of ancient humans there could have been roaming around that we still, haven't discovered yet. They could also, of course, be aliens, but I don't actually know. I don't actually think that.
Coming in at number 2, Lovelock Cave. In 1911, miners working in Nevada's Lovelock Cave were digging through piles of guano when they stumbled upon a massive wealth of ancient relics. The miners began searching, and as they sifted through the relics, they found something as exciting as it was confusing: the mummified remains of a 6'6" man with red hair. With this discovery, the cave became an archaeological dig site, and soon even more strange discoveries were being made. Things like 15-inch sandals which appeared to have been used, as well as a giant handprint that was twice the size of any normal handprint. Now, what is extremely incredible about the discovery is that there is an old Paiute legend that talks about red-haired, freckled-faced, man-eating giants who invaded the land and preyed on the Paiute people until they managed to chase the giants into a cave and set it on fire. And some have reason to believe that this archaeological discovery could actually back up the legend. Sadly, the original red-headed mummy has been destroyed, which makes everything a bit more difficult to prove, but one explanation is that the giants could have been a real group of violent European explorers, people who tormented the indigenous peoples and then met their end in Nevada.
The Antikythera mechanism, a very fascinating archaeological discovery that continues to puzzle researchers to this day. It was found in 1901 off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera in the wreckage of an ancient ship. The device seems to be this intricate mechanical calculator believed to date back between 150 and 100 BC. Its purpose and origin still not 100% known, but its complexity is pretty astonishing, especially for the time, meaning that more advanced technology could have been present in ancient times that we're completely unaware of. Some researchers think it was used for astronomical calculations or as a calendar, but it's kinda still speculative. What they do know is that the level of craftsmanship and sophistication involved is pretty impressive. It changed assumptions about ancient technology, and despite extensive research, certain aspects of its design and function remain unknown.
Starting off this countdown, we have the sinners. During construction near Oxford United Football Stadium, workers discovered a very creepy burial ground. The burial site had around 100 skeletons, and it's thought that they were 600 to 900 years old. The bones included someone with leprosy, someone who suffered a blunt force trauma, and a woman buried face down. What came of most interest to researchers was this woman. Typically, women were buried face down if they were an accused witch, or if they were a sinner. Researchers believe that this woman was actually a nun who was accused of getting it on with the priests. It was thought that if you bury any sinners face down, then this prevents the impure soul from threatening the living. Hence why she was buried face down. Moving on to number 9, we have the vampires. During the construction of a roadway near Gliwice in Poland, they came across what they thought were the remains of World War II soldiers. However, upon investigating, it was discovered that the remains belonged to vampires. Well, people who were accused of being vampires. They found that their heads had been chopped off and then placed on their legs. This was done to ensure that the dead stayed dead. Others were found with punctured spines, or their heads wedged between heavy stones. Again, this was all preventative measures done to ensure that the vampires don't rise out of their graves. But these vampires were mainly people who suffered from diseases or deformities, which caused them to behave strangely. And strange or unusual behavior meant that you were evil. In our 8th spot, we have the Neanderthal family. Archaeologists in Spain discovered the remains of a family of 12 Neanderthals. But sadly, this family succumbed to a tragic fate around 49,000 years ago. The bodies were found with marks all over their bodies, leading researchers to believe that they were killed by a cannibalistic Neanderthal family. Yep, they were eaten alive by another family. So the bodies had thin slashes on their bones from tools, thought to be from the cannibals hitting the bones to break them, and then they would feast on the bone marrow. Then evidence suggests that when they were finished, they used the victims' bones to sharpen the edge of their own tools. In our 7th spot, we have the screaming mummies. The first screaming mummy was found in 1886 by Deir el-Bahri. We call it the screaming mummy because the mummy was found with its mouth hanging wide open, looking like it was screaming. Then over the years, more and more screaming mummies were discovered, and this became a huge mystery. Were they buried alive or tortured? Why did they look like that? Researchers had no idea for the longest time. Now, the mummy that Deir was analyzing, he assumed that he had just been poisoned, and his mouth was open because when the poison was slowly kicking into effect, he knew what was happening and was shocked. But new evidence suggests that he was actually hung. But turns out that most of these mummies look like they're screaming because they were poorly wrapped. Yep, it's as simple as that. The jaw wasn't wrapped tight enough, so the mouth ended up naturally falling open. Nonetheless, they look 1,000 times creepier than other mummies. Making our way down the list, number 6, we have the bog bodies. Over 15 years ago, a group of archaeologists were exploring an area in Scotland when they came across some very creepy bodies. The bodies were of one female and one male who died about 3,000 years ago. But because of the state that they were in, it was believed that their bodies were thrown into a bog where they mummified for about 300 to 600 years. After that, they were taken out and buried. But something was off about these bodies. The woman's jaw was too large for her skull, and the man's limbs were off. Well, turns out that these bodies were the combination of 6 different people fused together, like some sort of Frankenstein monster. The female was combined with body parts from several other people who died around the same time as her, whereas the male had body parts from people who died hundreds of years before him. And the bones weren't just pushed together, no, they were actually attached properly. So why would someone do this, and Who did this? It's so creepy. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the sacrifices. Now, it's not new news that the Aztecs were a big fan of bloody sacrifices, but it's still quite shocking to come across sacrificial burial spots, because this next find revealed just how gruesome these rituals can get. So in 2004, a team discovered a number of decapitated and mutilated bodies outside of Mexico City. The bodies belonged to humans and animals. These rituals were performed as a way to feed the gods. It was believed that if you let the gods go hungry, then the sun would stop rising and the world would come to its end. In this burial spot, they found several skulls stuck together on a post, and others with holes in their head that were once used for decoration. I mean, it may not look so bad now, but imagine back in the day when the skulls still had the victim's skin and eyes and hair on it. Eey. In our 4th spot, we have the sunken skulls. In 2009, while excavating a dry lake bed in Motala, Sweden, a bunch of strange artifacts were found. There was a pile of animal bones, stone tools, and a bunch of skulls with stakes plunged through their heads. These skulls are 8,000 years old, and experts have no clue what happened to them. In fact, there's even one skull that has pieces of other skulls shoved up inside of it. Yeah, pretty disgusting. They think that this was either part of their funeral practices, or it was created as some sort of trophy by warriors who defeated their opponents. Moving on to number 3, we have the shackled skeletons. In 2016, a group of 80 skeletons were found buried in Athens, Greece. But these skeletons were found chained up with iron shackles still around their wrists. They are believed to be prisoners who died around 650 BC and 625 BC. These skeletons were found with terrified expressions plastered on their faces. Their necks were flexed and their jaws hung wide open. Studies showed that all the skeletons were males who suffered horrific deaths. They were chained up while an executioner went down the line, killing these men one by one while the others watched, waiting their turn. They were ruthless back in the day. I just want to know what these men did. In our 2nd spot, we have the expedition bones. Back in 1845, Sir John Franklin led 2 ships filled with 129 men to explore the Canadian Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. However, along the way, the ships ended up getting stuck in ice, and they all faced a chilling death. But thanks to the ice, the bodies of the crewmen were preserved. In the 1980s and the 1990s, researchers recovered the remains of the crew on King William Island, and they found some pretty terrifying things. It was thought that the crew resorted to cannibalism for their last couple of days. They had food aboard the ship, but many were sick from scurvy, tuberculosis, hypothermia, and pneumonia, which made them disoriented and a little wild. The crew were found with cut marks all over their body, indicating that their flesh was cut off the bones and eaten. On other men, their bones had been cracked open and the bone marrow was feasted on. What a very gruesome death. And in our number 1 spot, we have the severed hands. While doing a number of digs in Abydos, Egypt, one archaeologist found 4 different pits filled with severed hands. Yep. Nothing else, just piles and piles of hands. Each hand belonged to a different person, and they had been buried there 3,600 years ago. Now, before you think there's like some morbid hand serial killer on the loose, no, there actually is an explanation for this. But I don't think it makes it less creepy. So back in the day, it was a practice to actually remove the hand of your enemy. It was thought that by doing so, you would steal their power. You then could trade these hands in for a reward. The hands were then buried into these ceremonial pits. I'm just glad that this isn't a practice anymore.
First up, in our 10th spot today, we have screaming mummies. Okay, when you think of a classic mummy, what do you see? I'm going to assume you just replied, I see the mummy's face, and it looks like it's screaming as its mouth is, wide open. For a very long time, it was believed that mummies found with their mouth open were possibly people that were tortured to death, especially those found with their hands bounded together.
But in most recent years, scientists have learned how silly that theory might be because most mummies are actually found with that permanent screaming expression. During the mummification process, if the jaw isn't strapped shut, then the jaw naturally falls open when it begins to decay. But then again, we're also sure that some of the mummies were most likely buried alive, but it is possible that it could be too hard at this point to fully know. In our number 9 spot today is the mass grave of the headless Vikings. It was a sunny day. Just another casual digging expedition for these archaeologists, digging up the side of an old roadway in Dorset, UK. But suddenly, they dug up something extraordinary. It was a grave site for 54 Vikings, and they were all headless. The leg and arm bones and heads and torsos were all together neatly in separate piles. The archaeologists didn't know what to make of this, so their theory was that these people were captured by the locals and they were murdered and dismembered by the villagers who took some of their heads for souvenirs. Well, that's terrifying. Later on, they revamped that theory and they believed that perhaps that this was some kind of ritualistic sacrifice performed at this time. Yeah, perhaps scientists didn't want us to know this because, well, that is terrifying. Coming up in today's 8th spot, we have something that I personally think is highly unsettling, and I would like to inquire as to why wasn't this on the news stations everywhere around the world when it was discovered? Because this one is kinda hard to believe that it is real. Oh, what is it? Oh, it's just a cat that was carved into the hills of Peru. Yep, a cat. Come on, a cat? That's so creepy. I mean, I'm a dog person myself, so perhaps I'm a little biased, but I mean, cultures have been known to worship and honor the cat throughout centuries, including the Egyptians and, well, North Americans nowadays. They have, a lot of crazy cat ladies, but who knows, maybe there's a higher reason that cats were continuously worshipped and perhaps we should honor them. This cat geoglyph was found in the Nazca Desert and it is said to be the oldest one in its region, dating to 200 BC to 100 BC. The cat is apparently 120 feet. Wow, how isn't this more known? I'm mind blown. All the crazy cat Karens are saying, excuse me, I knew this. Coming up in our 7th spot today, we have the Tomb of Sunken Skulls. Found in the bottom of a prehistoric dry lake bed in Motala, Sweden, archaeologists stumbled upon a mysterious stone structure. After some digging, they were able to eventually unearth animal bones, stone tools, and 8,000-year-old skulls of 10 people aging from young to old. Sometimes it's hard for me to fathom that it is possible for archaeologists to know that something is really that old. Like, how is this possible? That we are able to know this, and yet we haven't made a time machine yet. But also, if you really sit and think about how far we've come in the last 100 years, it really makes you think, holy, I wish I could travel in time to see how people actually lived then. Because even with our discoveries to paint a picture, it's still quite hard to imagine. They also found fragments of one skull deliberately put into the skull of another. What purpose was this for? The archaeologists concluded that actually 11 people were butchered in a stone hut, with no other discovery as to why. But one last final horrific detail: some of the skulls had stakes embedded into them, and it was concluded that they were perhaps mounted for some funeral purpose or as a sort of trophy after the defeat of its opponents. In our 6th spot today, we have a discovery that honestly, I wish I didn't know about. For all the mothers out there that are feeling a little sensitive, definitely, close your ears to this one. While on an expedition deep in the underground sewer in Ashkelon, Israel, expecting to only find dirt and, well, poop, archaeologists discovered thousands of tiny bones. After further inspection, they discovered that the bones were of newborn babies, maybe around 100 of newborn babies. Just horrible. It wasn't completely uncommon though for ancient times to dispose of newborns, particularly girls who were considered not as valuable to the family as boys. But it is interesting though that there were actually quite a few boys that were found. It was and still is so curious that those bones were disposed of in a sewer. If I could guess, I think this sounds like the case of some religious sacrifice, but who knows? In our 5th spot today, we have the Mammoth Graveyard. An expedition in Russia led to a discovery of what looks like a graveyard of mammoth bones from 25,000 years ago. The site has been under excavation since 2014, and it is said that it measures 40 feet across. Whoa. At this point, archaeologists still don't know how it was built, and also why. What was the purpose of this? I I suspect aliens. Aliens came down to Earth and had a sacrificial mammoth ceremony and then gathered all of the bones in one area and left them for us humans to eventually clean up. That sounds possible. In our fourth spot today, we have severed hands. While on an Egyptian expedition, a group of archaeologists whom were digging near the ancient city of Avaris discovered a few chopped off hands. The hands were found in what was once a throne room, and therefore there was an immediate understanding that this was some kind of gesture for the king. The team ended up discovering 14 hands, and the even more interesting part, it was all right hands. The hands are about 3,600 years old. Eventually, it was discovered that they were buried when King Kian ruled over the city. Only through reviewing ancient writing were they able to put the pieces together and see that during this time, the soldiers would present a severed right hand of his enemy to the king in exchange for gold. It was said to be a symbolic gesture, showing that they are depriving their enemy of power as they will no longer have their hand. Fascinating. It's crazy to believe that we humans once were in a headspace where we were chopping off hands so as to take other humans' power away from them. Fascinating. In our third spot today, we have the good old Neanderthals. Archaeologists have discovered that some 40,000 years ago, Belgians, also known as Neanderthals, were practicing cannibalism. They used to make a meal out of their friends and create tools out of their bones. At least they weren't wasteful. This discovery was made in a cave where Neanderthal bones were discovered along with marks of butchery. There were also bones of horses and other animals in the cave, but they seemed to be stripped apart just like the human bones were, leading the archaeologists to conclude that these Neanderthals seemed to make no distinction between man and animal, which poses the question, at what point did we start making this distinction? And are there still people who don't? Google the conspiracies around this at your own risk. In our second spot today, we have the claw. In 1986, while on an expedition on Mount Owen in New Zealand, a giant claw was found. Deep within a cave in the mountain, the archaeologists discovered this massive beast-like claw. It was eventually discovered that it was the 3,000-year-old remains of an upland moa, a flightless bird that went extinct, which you would think to be impossible as well. It kind of reminds me of how all the Kardashian-like girls wear their nails these days. I mean, how do they function with those nails? I can barely type and I barely have nails. Melissa. In our number one spot today, we have the chemical warfare. On an expedition in 1933, archaeologist Robert de Mesnil du Buisson discovered 19 Roman soldiers in a tunnel. Apparently, they all look like they died trying to flee from something. I can't imagine what during those times. Traces of sulfur and bitumen were actually found along the walls until it was eventually discovered that all signs point to this being one of the first attempts at chemical warfare. Whoa. And honestly, hopefully one of the last. That's all I'm saying.